the stranger in the woods. During my time in college, I had a friend whose father owned a large piece of land in eastern Texas, about 800 acres. In the past, he had leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but he wasn't doing that anymore. A few years earlier, he had built a cabin on the property and would let us go out there from time to unwind. It was a great escape from school and a chance to connect with nature. During spring break one year, we packed up our trucks and headed to the cabin. Our plan was simple: shooting, drinking, and all the other things a bunch of country boys like to do in the woods. The first morning was spent cleaning up the cabin and settling in. By dinner time, we had a big fire going and cooked up steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert, cracked open some beers, and as the sun went down, we passed around a joint or two. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went to check it out. The fire had burned down to embers, and just beyond its dim glow, I thought I saw the shape of a man standing completely still. He seemed to be facing me, waiting to see what I would do. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the darkness made it impossible to see clearly. The figure didn't move, and I felt both terrified and drawn to it. Whether it was my curiosity or the alcohol clouding my judgment, I took a few hesitant steps forward. Just then, my friend's voice startled me. He had woken up, seen the door wide open, and come outside to check on me. When I asked if he could see the figure across the fire, he just laughed and said I was too stoned. I laughed it off, but as I headed back inside, I glanced one last time. The figure was gone. The next morning, I brushed off the experience as a result of too much partying and went about my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the pond, then spent the afternoon shooting. One guy had even brought a compound bow. After dinner, the drinks and smokes came back out, and we sat around the fire telling stories. Later that night, on one of my many trips to relieve myself, I heard a stick snap nearby. My heart jumped, and I hurried back to the fire, looking over my shoulder the whole way. My panicked expression got plenty of laughs from the others. They reminded me that we weren't the only creatures in the woods, and I let myself believe it was just an animal. Not long after, I was deep in conversation with one of the guys when I turned to speak to the person next to me. My whole body tensed. Standing just behind my friend was a man I didn't recognize. He had appeared out of nowhere, staring intently at the back of my friend's head, almost as if he was trying to bore a hole through it with his eyes. I couldn't move. As I studied him, I realized he was the same figure I had seen the night before. He was of average height, with a long, unkempt beard. My friend kept talking, completely unaware of the presence behind him. After several long moments, the stranger slowly turned to look at me, his expression blank. Then, without a word, he walked away into the darkness. That was when my friend finally noticed my horrified expression. The moment he spoke, I snapped out of my frozen state and started frantically explaining what I had just seen. Again, I was met with laughter. They joked that I had spotted Bigfoot, and despite my insistence, no one believed me. Frustrated, I eventually gave up trying to convince them. Determined to prove the man's existence, I kept a watchful eye for the next couple of days, but nothing happened. By the fifth morning, I started questioning myself. I had seen him twice, so why had he suddenly vanished? That day, my friend's father mentioned that a neighboring landowner had seen a group of wild hogs running through his property. We grabbed our rifles and went looking. After tracking them for a while, we finally spotted 3 large hogs rooting around. We quietly chambered rounds and prepared to fire. Just as I was about to count down, a deafening crack rang out, followed by a spray of bark from a tree above my friend's head. For a moment, we didn't understand what had happened. Then, another shot, this one even closer. Someone was shooting at us. We didn't wait for a third. My friend, who seemed to be the target, led us down a side trail back to the cabin. We thought we were safe until the gunfire started again. With no other choice, we jumped into my truck and sped off. Cell phones weren't common yet, so we had to drive 20 miles into town to get help. When we returned with the sheriff's deputies, the property was eerily quiet. We stayed in our vehicles, waiting to see if the shooter would fire again. Nothing happened. A quick survey of the cabin showed 3 bullet holes, along with 2 more in my friend's truck windshield. Strangely, all of our belongings had been dragged out and scattered across the ground. Nothing was missing, except for a box of ammunition and, oddly enough, my sleeping bag and wool blanket. The deputies suspected we had run into a squatter or a poacher who had been camping on the land. At first, they didn't seem too concerned about tracking him down, but when my friend's father found out, he pressured them to take the case seriously. That was when I told them about the strange figure I had seen lurking around. This time, no one laughed. A search of the property was launched, though school had already started again by then. The search lasted a full week, but other than a few abandoned campsites, nothing concrete was found. The assumption was that whoever he was, he had realized the heat was on him and moved on. During the investigation, authorities looked into escaped convicts and other possible suspects, but no one matching the stranger's description was ever identified. To this day, his identity remains a mystery. With the risk of another attack, we stopped going to the cabin. The next year, we tried camping elsewhere, but it wasn't the same. Our group eventually stopped taking nature trips altogether. A few years later, my friend's father suffered a heart attack and lost interest in the property. The land was leased out again, and now the trees are used for paper and pulpwood products. Every time I jot down a note, I can't help but think of those trips, and especially that one terrifying week that ended them. I still talk to my old college friend once or twice a year. As far as he knows, the stranger was never caught. Sometimes we speculate about who he was and where he might have gone, but when I'm alone, I think about it much more deeply. Why did he seem to focus so much on my friend? And perhaps more unsettling, could he still be out there waiting for his chance to finish what he started all those years ago? The haunting presence of Wayne. Camping has never been my thing. It's not that I dislike nature, I just prefer sleeping in a bed rather than on the ground in a tent. Every time the topic comes up with friends or family, I have to be talked into it. On this particular trip, my boyfriend convinced me to go by, promising we'd be staying in a cabin. That was enough to get me on board, though I still would have preferred a beach vacation. It was the 2 of us and 2 other couples, 6 of us in total. We found a nice, secluded cabin in the woods, just a short walk from a beautiful lake where we could swim. I didn't want to admit it, but once we arrived, I was actually excited about the trip. The first day was perfect. We spent hours hiking trails, swimming in the lake, and by evening, we grilled steaks and relaxed under the stars. It was shaping up to be a great getaway. That night, we all headed to bed around midnight. I had trouble sleeping though. I kept thinking I heard noises outside, rustling, maybe even footsteps. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, we were in the woods. Hearing strange noises at night wasn't unusual. The next morning, as we were getting ready for another hike, a voice called out from behind us. "Why, hello there! How are y'all doing today?" We turned to see a large man approaching. He was well over 6 feet tall with a big belly, dressed in jeans, hiking boots, and a backpack. My boyfriend, always the social butterfly, immediately struck up a conversation with him. The man introduced himself as Wayne. He told us he lived nearby and knew all the trails in the area like the back of his hand. He said he'd heard us talking and wanted to make sure we were settling in okay. His presence was a little strange, but not outright alarming. He seemed friendly enough, laughing in a jolly way before heading off down the trail. As we hiked, we joked about Wayne, mimicking his cheerful voice. None of us thought much of it. Later that afternoon, we went to the lake to swim. While we were lounging on the dock, soaking up the sun, we suddenly heard that same voice again. "There they are!" We all jumped. Standing at the edge of the dock was Wayne. We asked what he was doing there, and he gave the same excuse. He had just been wandering by and happened to see us. My boyfriend, ever the polite one, chatted with him for a few minutes, but something about the encounter felt off. My friend Tina's boyfriend and I exchanged uneasy glances. The whole time Wayne was talking, he kept nodding, laughing, and looking around like he was scanning the area. Eventually, he mumbled a few quiet "okays" to himself and walked away. That evening, we sat around the campfire, telling scary stories, but I felt unsettled. I couldn't shake the weird vibe from Wayne. Then, out of nowhere, he jumped out of the bushes. "Here I am," he shouted, followed by a loud, excited laugh. We all screamed. My boyfriend was furious. He told Wayne that what he did wasn't funny and that he needed to leave. He even warned him that he was lucky none of us had reacted out of instinct. Wayne's cheerful demeanor disappeared. He looked genuinely hurt and insisted he was just trying to make our trip more memorable. After a few awkward moments, he walked off down a trail. For a second, I almost felt bad for him. Then it hit me. Why was he still out here, lurking in the woods near our cabin, after 11 p.m.? The mood was ruined. None of us felt like sitting around the fire anymore, so we called it a night. As we got ready for bed, I told my boyfriend I had a bad feeling. I was convinced Wayne would come back. And what if the strange noises I heard the night before had been him? That night, I lay awake again. At some point, I heard it. Soft footsteps outside the cabin. Then, breathing. I froze. My heart pounded as I nudged my boyfriend awake. "Please check," I whispered. He groggily got up, walked to the window, and peeked out. Suddenly, his whole body stiffened. His face went pale. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Someone's out there." He's pacing back and forth. I crept over and carefully looked outside. It was Wayne. He was mumbling to himself, shaking his head as if arguing with an invisible person. Then, he walked up to the cabin door and tried to open it. When he realized it was locked, he started pounding his fists against his forehead, growing increasingly agitated. We watched, paralyzed, as he paced for a few more minutes. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished into the darkness. We didn't know what to do. My boyfriend immediately called the owner of the cabin, who told us to call the police. When an officer arrived a few minutes later, we explained everything. Wayne's strange appearances, his attempt to enter our cabin, and the fact that he seemed unstable. The officer didn't seem overly concerned. He just nodded, almost like he was humoring us. I got the feeling he wasn't taking the situation seriously at all. By that point, none of us felt safe. We stayed awake the rest of the night, drinking coffee and waiting for the first sign of daylight. As soon as the sun came up, we loaded up our van and got the hell out of there. As we reached the main road, we spotted him. Wayne was walking alone, mumbling to himself, occasionally hitting his head. He didn't even acknowledge us as we drove past. We called the police dispatcher to report his location, but that was the last we ever heard about it. I don't know if they ever found him or if he just disappeared back into the woods. Did he actually live nearby? Or was he just some strange drifter looking for trouble? I don't know. And honestly, I don't care. All I know is that from now on, my friends and family can go camping without me. The Unwelcoming Woods. I'm sharing this for entertainment and feedback. 80% for the story, 20% to hear your thoughts. But let me be clear, this is entirely non-fictional. I'm not a spiritual person. I don't believe in energies, vibes, or any of that. I'm a cynic, especially when it comes to paranormal things. But some people, I suppose, are more in tune with their surroundings than I am. I live in the foothills of western North Carolina, right at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I spent a few years in the mountains and hated every second of it. I despise the woods with a passion. And just my luck, I ended up back at my parents' cabin, completely surrounded by them. Our family owns 15 acres of woodland, and despite my aversion to nature, I've always felt safe in these particular woods. I grew up climbing trees, splashing in the creek, and battling imaginary enemies with stick swords. This place is home. Except for the stretch of woods behind our backyard. Our cabin sits at the top of a steep hill that slopes down for about half a mile before leveling out at a creek. Halfway down is a small clearing right behind our fenced-in yard. It's always in the shade. No thick undergrowth, just trees, patches of red clay, and piles of leaves. On the surface, it's unremarkable, but something about it is wrong. I can't explain it. I just know I don't belong there. None of us do. My parents avoid it. Our pets, past and present, won't go near it. And when I was a kid, I had a few experiences that made sure I'd stay away too. The night in the tent, when I was around 8 or 9, I decided to camp in the backyard. I set up our old, rarely used tent, dragged in an air mattress, a pile of blankets, my favorite stuffed deer, and a stack of comic books. It was supposed to be fun. Even before the sun set, and though I felt uneasy, something about the woods just beyond the yard felt off, but I was 20 feet from the house. I told myself I'd be fine. I was not fine. I settled in, reading comics by flashlight, feeling like a real outdoorsman. But as soon as it got dark, I heard it. Loud, rhythmic crunching in the woods behind the yard. Something big was circling just beyond the fence. We don't have bears in this area, and whatever it was walking on 2 legs. It never came closer, never tried to enter the yard. It just kept pacing in circles, over and over. I sat there frozen, clutching my stuffed deer, listening. I lasted maybe an hour before I bolted inside and climbed into my own bed. When I was about 11, my mom decided to start a garden in the backyard. She set up raised beds for herbs and vegetables, and naturally roped me into helping. The entire time we worked, I noticed something strange. We both felt incredibly irritable. My mom and I are close. We never fight. But back there, surrounded by those trees, we snapped at each other constantly. It was also disturbingly quiet. No birds, no wind in the leaves, just an oppressive, pressing silence. The garden actually thrived for a while, but my mom never wanted to tend to it alone. She always waited for me to get home from school before going down there. When I got older, she finally admitted why. She hated being back there by herself. She felt unwelcome, like she was trespassing on something's land. Eventually, we abandoned the garden altogether. The raised beds are still there, rotting away. I haven't been back to look at them since middle school. I'm 23 now. This is the one that unsettles me the most. When I was around 13 or 14, my mom offered to cut my hair outside since it was a warm, breezy day. Easier cleanup. I dragged a stool to the backyard, and she got to work. At first, it was fine. We talked, joked, like usual. But then, that awful, creeping feeling returned. We were not welcome. The air around us felt darker, colder, despite the bright sun overhead. My mom finished up, stepping in front of me to check her work. I sat still as she tilted my head, angling it this way and that. Then 3 things happened, all at once. First, I felt a tight squeeze in my chest, like something was pressing the air out of my lungs. I froze. Second, my mom's expression went completely blank. Her eyes lost focus, her smile faded. She looked vacant, like she wasn't really there anymore. Third, without warning, she raised the scissors and snipped, cutting a deep gash right over my left eye. I jumped up, stumbling away. At the same time, she seemed to snap out of it, gasping like she'd just woken from a trance. She was horrified, kept apologizing over and over, near tears. We left everything behind and ran inside to stop the bleeding. I still have a scar from that cut. And here's the thing. There wasn't even any hair over my eye. I had a pixie cut at the time. There was nothing for her to trim. The woods remain. I haven't stepped foot in that part of the yard in years, but now that I'm living here again, I sometimes catch myself staring at it from the window, feeling that same deep, instinctive unease. Why do we all avoid it? Why do the pets refuse to go near it? Why is it so unnaturally dark and silent, even in the middle of the day? I don't have answers. And my parents and I, we just pretend it isn't there. The girl on the saltflats. I'm posting this in hopes that someone outside my circle can help me make sense of one of the strangest and most unsettling encounters I've ever had. Bear with me. There's some setup, but the story won't make sense without it. I live in Utah and spend nearly every weekend exploring the vast emptiness of the state's West Desert. For the past decade, I've been obsessed with one particular mountain range outside of Wendover, on the far west side of the state. I know this range better than anyone. I've hiked every peak, explored every abandoned mine, and driven every canyon road. The area sits beside the Bonneville Saltflats, a massive dry lake bed stretching nearly 50 square miles. If you're unfamiliar, it's one of the few places on Earth flat and open enough to host land speed record races. Cars have reached nearly 800 miles per hour here. When races aren't happening, you're free to drive out onto the flats. Camping there is surreal. When the wind isn't bad, the silence is absolute. I do it often, almost always alone. I have a favorite camping spot deep in the flats, about 10 miles from the nearest road. Out there, there's no sagebrush, no rocks, no landmarks of any kind. Just endless white salt. If you see another person out there, you stay away. You don't know why they're there. Maybe they're running drugs. Maybe they're hiding a body. Caution is a necessity. In 10 years of doing this, I've never had an issue. I've never seen anyone get close to me. Until August 31st, 2019. That day, it was brutally hot, 104 degrees. I set up a bright orange sun shelter next to my truck and spent the day in total silence. The heat had baked the salt into curled, crispy layers, making a loud crunching noise whenever I walked. I saw no cars, no movement, just the occasional distant rumble of a train, almost 10 miles away. Around 7 p.m., I dozed off under my shelter, waking up about an hour later. As I stood to stretch, I did a slow 360-degree scan of the horizon. Nothing. The sun was still high enough to see clearly, but the silence remained unbroken. I grabbed my axe and began chopping wood for a fire, only a few feet from my truck. After 2 or 3 minutes, I heard something behind me. Fabric rustling, like my shelter shifting in the wind. Only there was no wind. I turned around, and that's when I saw her. A girl. She was about 50 yards away, walking toward my camp at a slight diagonal. My blood ran cold. She hadn't been there seconds ago. I would have seen her. I would have heard her. And yet, there she was, moving at a casual pace, completely alone. She looked about 18 years old, wearing a homemade tie-dye shirt, jean shorts, and Converse sneakers. No hat, no sunglasses, no backpack, no water. Just walking. She didn't look lost or distressed. She wasn't sunburned or dirty. She didn't seem tired. She was just there. I quickly scanned behind her, searching for a car, another person, anything. Nothing. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I put down my axe and blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "Hot day for a walk, ain't it? Everything all right?" She didn't stop. She didn't even look at me. Without breaking stride, she gave a small, lazy motion over her shoulder and said, "My friends are right there." She gestured behind her, toward the empty horizon. I followed her thumb. There was no one there. I turned back to her, but she was already passing my truck, heading toward the mountains miles away. I was so stunned by the suddenness of her appearance and the sheer impossibility of the situation that I didn't react. By the time I thought to offer her water or ask if she needed help, she was already 150 yards away. But I could still hear her footsteps. That same crisp crunch of salt, impossibly clear, as if she were still standing right next to me. I grabbed my binoculars and locked onto her, fully expecting her to vanish like a mirage. She didn't. For 15 minutes, I watched her walk. She never turned back, never changed pace. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, and she began blending into the darkening landscape. Then I heard a phone ring. I didn't have cell service. Through the binoculars, I saw her reach into her pocket, answer the call, and start talking. I could hear the faint murmur of her voice. Another impossibility in the crushing silence of the flats. A minute later, I heard something else. An engine. I turned around. A set of headlights appeared on the distant horizon, racing toward me from 3 miles away. The vehicle was moving fast. Too fast for rough terrain like this. Panic set in. Was this a setup? A robbery? Was I being targeted? I took cover behind my truck and waited. The car, a late 90s Range Rover, came flying past my camp, kicking up a massive dust cloud. It headed straight toward where I had last seen the girl. I turned back through the binoculars. She was gone. A few minutes later, I saw the Rover's taillights near where she had disappeared. They hit the brakes, then the headlights came back on, then brake lights again. It looked like they were spinning donuts on the salt. Then they turned around, and they came back. They were heading toward me. Fast. I crouched behind my truck, my heart pounding. I chambered around into my handgun. The Rover roared past me again, even closer this time. They didn't stop. And then, they were gone. I waited, scanning the horizon for movement, but the night remained silent. After a while, I packed up my camp and drove 10 miles into the foothills, hoping for cell service. Still nothing. The next morning, as soon as I reached town, I called the sheriff and reported everything. They weren't concerned. That was it. I never heard anything else about it. I still don't know what I saw that night. Why was she out there, 10 miles from anything, with no supplies? Who was she talking to? Why did she walk right up to my camp, act completely unconcerned, and then vanish? And most unsettling of all, why could I hear her footsteps, even when she was nearly a mile away? I've been back to the flats many times since then, but I've never camped there alone again.